If you're a beginner leather crafter who wants to take the leap from hand to machine sewing, here's everything you need to know. Welcome back to our Beginner's Guide to Leathercraft series. This is episode 4. We've got the first 3 videos linked below if you need to get caught up. But today we have a fun topic. Sewing is the bread and butter of what we do here at Sailrite. We've been engineering and selling heavy-duty machines here for decades. We've even got one that's set up for leatherwork right out of the box, and it's called the Leatherwork machine. The Sailrite Leatherwork is an entry-level machine that can handle a wide variety of leather types, and my favorite features on it are the compact size and the built-in speed reducer. If you're looking for something more industrial, turn to the Sailrite Fabricator. This compound walking foot machine features a larger sewing surface, and it can sew up to 20 ounces of leather without breaking a sweat. And that's just because it has a taller foot clearance than the Leatherwork machine. But before we dive into all the technical aspects of these machines and start sewing, let's try and answer this question. Why would you want a sewing machine, and when is it time to get your first machine? If you do already have a machine and you want to just skip to my tips and tricks, you can go to this timestamp right here. By far the best reason to upgrade to a sewing machine is time. If you're watching this video, you've probably hand sewn something and you know it can be tedious and time consuming, and machine sewing just speeds up the entire process and lets you get the most out of those valuable hours you have to work on your projects. We ran an experiment to find out about how much faster using a machine is. I made 2 identical coasters to compare. I had to punch stitching holes for the hand-sewn coaster, and that took 3 minutes and 28 seconds before I could start sewing. And I'll admit, I'm not the fastest saddle stitcher, but it took me about 20 minutes. And that means the total is 23 minutes and 32 seconds. For the machine stitch coaster, it took me just 2 minutes and 43 seconds on the Leatherwork machine. So for this project, machine sewing is about 11 times faster, so just imagine the time saving for larger projects. But what about the quality of the stitches? Well, don't worry, we'll come back to that later in the video. The second reason you might want a sewing machine is to increase your production capacity. If you have any aspirations to sell your work, or you just want to be able to make more things and give them to friends and family, a sewing machine allows you to make more things in less time. And lastly, I just have a lot of fun using sewing machines, and it opens up a lot of possibilities for projects. Before I had a sewing machine, bigger projects like a purse or a backpack would intimidate me because all I could imagine was me hunched over a chair for hours on end hand sewing something until my fingers were about to bleed. And that was enough reason to dissuade me from attempting those sort of larger projects and growing my skill set. So let's move on to the second question of when you might want to upgrade to a sewing machine. Firstly, it's when you have determined that you enjoy leatherworking, but you feel like you've plateaued as far as the type of projects that you can make. Because like I mentioned earlier, a sewing machine opens up a world of possibilities. 2, when you feel like you don't have enough time to finish your projects and you want to be able to speed things up significantly. 3, you want to produce more and sell your products. 4, if you have hand dexterity issues like arthritis that make hand sewing difficult or painful. And 5, when you want to learn a new skill. Machine sewing is a great way to broaden your crafting repertoire. So let's take a closer look at our machines that I keep talking about and see how they work. To do this, I'm going to be sewing a tote bag, the wallet, and some scraps. I always like to have a guideline to keep me on track, so I either use a wing divider or a stitching groover to prep my piece for sewing. The wing divider simply scores a line in the leather, but the groover actually cuts a groove for the stitch to sit in. I usually opt for the wing divider because a mistake with this tool is almost invisible, whereas a mistake with a stitch groover will stick out like a sore thumb. Now that we have a line to aim for, let's set up our machine to sew. Our machines are heavy-duty, walking foot, straight stitch machines. They have brushless servo motors, which allow you to sew at incredibly slow and controlled speeds when necessary. Machines with these characteristics are necessary to properly sew leather. Choosing the right needle and thread is important to get clean stitches on both the top and the bottom side of your workpiece. And my go-to setup and a good starting point for most leatherworkers is a Tex 90 thread with a size 18 needle. The term Tex refers to a thread sizing system that measures the weight in grams of 1,000 meters of thread. And here's a chart to show the proper pairing of needle and thread sizes. And I try to keep on the smaller side when it comes to needles so that the holes are as small and tidy as possible. Now let's move on to thread. Nylon and polyester thread are best for leatherwork because they're synthetic fibers, which allows you to melt the end and lock your stitch into place. And I'd recommend starting off with polyester while you learn your machine because it makes adjusting your tension just a bit easier since it's less stretchy than nylon. And when it comes to sizing, for leatherwork, I'd consider Tex 70 thread lightweight, 90 medium weight, 135 is medium to heavy, and anything 210 or above I would consider heavyweight. And aesthetically, my favorite is going to be 90. I think it just strikes the perfect balance between looking strong yet sleek. And it's also just a bit easier to sew than 135 and 210. Now looking back at our needles, you should know that sewing leather requires leather point needles. These are specially designed to cut clean holes into the leather, whereas standard sewing needles usually have a more blunt point that is made to push between those fabric fibers. The standard leather sewing needle has a diamond point, but there are other specialty needles that give a more decorative look. Example of these would be triangle, perpendicular, and twist point. In my experience, those needles take a little bit more fine tuning to get perfect stitches, so I'd recommend starting off with those diamond point needles. If you're interested though, you can check out this video if you want to learn more about each of those specialty needles. If you use the wrong needle and thread, your stitches might look sloppy, it can cause tension issues, and you may even break a needle and throw off the timing of your machine. I'm going to go ahead and practice on a scrap piece and fold it over to the same thickness as my wallet and walk you through how I set up my machine for this project. Let's start off by choosing what stitch length we want. The Leatherwork machine has the easy set stitch length plate, where we can set the stitch length for both forward and reverse sewing. We could set it here for tiny stitches or all the way up to 6 millimeters. The Fabricator also can sew a wide range of stitch lengths up to 8 millimeters, although it uses a different mechanism to set the stitch length. We simply turn this knob and select the length we want and use this lever to switch from forward and reverse sewing. The sweet spot for me when it comes to stitch length is about 3 millimeters. If I'm doing detailed or decorative work, I may go down to 2 millimeters, or if I'm using a larger thread or have a really long piece to sew, then maybe I'll go up to 5 millimeters. But personally, I've never had a reason to use a 6 or 8 millimeter stitch length. My preference is definitely smaller stitches just because of the aesthetics and the way that it allows for more smoothly rounded corners. And after I've set my stitch length, I'll quickly sew a piece of scrap so we can check our tension. The way I like to think about tension is how hard the top stitch and the bottom stitch are pulling against each other. It's important to double check this to make sure they are interacting in such a way that our knot gets pulled right into the middle of the leather. If our top tension is too tight, it pulls the knot up to the surface, and if our top tension is too loose, the tension from the bobbin thread, which is where the underside thread comes from, will pull the knot to the bottom side. You'll rarely need to adjust that bottom tension, so let me show you how to adjust the top tension on the industrial sewing machine. You'll see that both machines have tension plates that can be tightened and loosened by simply turning these knobs. And if the knot is being pulled to the top, we'll loosen the plates by turning left. And I'll do this at about a half turn or even a full turn until I see that knot disappear into the middle of the leather. Incorrect tension is the biggest mistake that I see beginners make. Getting this part wrong will greatly affect the look of your stitch. If you typically sew the same thickness of leather, you may be able to set this once and forget it. But if you alternate between different types of projects with varying thicknesses, you should probably fine-tune your tension each time before you sew. Now, all the prep work is done, so let's sew our wallet project together. I'll place the piece under the needle, making sure it's right above my guideline, and go ahead and drop the needle. Now I'll set my magnetic sewing guide against the edge. Between my guideline and the edge guide, that will ensure my stitch is equal distant from the edge all the way around. To begin sewing, I'll grab the loose threads and keep slight tension on them to sew those first few stitches. As I sew, I'll explain the importance of locking stitches to prevent unraveling. For straight lines that don't connect, it's important to lock both the beginning and end of your stitch. Most people sew forwards, then back stitch, and then forwards again to start off their stitch, but I actually prefer to start off in reverse, sewing 2 to 3 stitches, and then securing them by sewing forward and continuing the line. This method avoids the bulkiness of 3 layers of thread. To finish the stitch, I sink the needle at the end, and just as it starts coming up, we put it in reverse and do about 3 back stitches. When sewing a circle that will connect with itself, I simply sew over about 3 stitches to lock everything into place. To finish things up, I'll cut my threads, giving myself a few inches of thread, just in case I need to pull that last stitch into the middle of the leather. Finally, I'll snip off the excess and seal the ends with a thread burner. This makes it look better and helps lock that stitch into place. To finish out this video, let's circle back to the hand sewing versus machine sewing discussion. You'll see that with my properly set up machine and the right needle and thread, I'm able to get extremely similar looking results. I use the Japanese style pricking irons on the hand sewing coaster that give you those nice decorative slanted stitches that people love. For the machine stitch coaster, my secret weapon was the twist point needle, which is one of the decorative needles I mentioned earlier. Results like these are why I choose to machine sew more often than not. That's all I've got for you today. I hope you learned something about sewing leather. I also hope that this video will help you determine when and if you should get a sewing machine for your leather projects. If you're interested in picking up one of these machines or any of the needles and threads that I use, those will be listed in the description. And as always, leave me a question in the comments below. I try to answer every single one of those. See you next time in episode 5.